week, Jasper and I are going to bring you up to Meeker County, Minnesota. It's in south central Minnesota, to do some winter camping and exploration wrapped around the history of the 1862 Dakota War. My home is down near Wabasso, Minnesota, about 15 miles southwest of Redwood Falls, not too far from the Minnesota River Valley. Both the Upper Sioux and Lower Sioux Indian reservations reside along that river valley. And it makes sense that as you travel through the river valley, you're going to find a lot of historic markers and a few battlefields related to the 1862 conflict. It was one of Minnesota's bloodiest events, and there's a lot of interesting history wrapped around that. You might be surprised to know, though, that that conflict actually started up in Meeker County. I grew up in Meeker County, probably 15 miles from where that event started, and I had no idea as I was growing up that that occurred, and the history in Meeker County wrapped around that event. So we're going to go up and explore that this weekend and take you along for the ride. everyone. As you can see, we're camped out at the farm site of where I grew up at, and it's about 15 below zero this morning, so I'm taking some opportunity to edit some of the video and so forth from our trip exploring some history around the 1862 Dakota War. Our exploration is going to pertain to about 3 separate locations in Meeker County wrapped around that event. In 1862, there were several distinct bands of Native Americans, mainly living in areas along the Minnesota River. Both the Upper and Lower Sioux communities exist today along the Minnesota River, the Upper Sioux Agency near Granite Falls, and the Lower Sioux Agency just east of Redwood Falls, just south of Morton, Minnesota. When you travel the Minnesota Scenic Byway along the river, you'll find monuments, plaques, and battlefields related to the 1862 war scattered along the valley. The Minnesota River itself is full of history and will likely be a place we explore on a future video as well. I was surprised to learn that the war actually began 50 miles north of that area in Meeker County, Minnesota, where we're at right now. More specifically, in Acton Township within Meeker County, just south of the current-day Grove City, Minnesota. As I stated in the intro, this is where I grew up, about 15 miles south of that first blood incident. When visiting the sites in Meeker County, the information you read on a few of the markers doesn't really do justice to the events that took place on that day, or what led up to the event itself. In order to put these events into perspective, you really need some background information in order to help you understand why these things happened and what took place. The Native American tribes that occupied the lands in Minnesota hunted and managed their own land. They really were not farmers in the way settlers thought about farming, but they were stewards of their own land, and they were able to gather the things they needed to thrive. As European settlers started moving to Minnesota, large portions of land were obtained through treaties with the Native American tribes. These treaties specified payments of money, food, and supplies in exchange for the land. There were also promises made to help them build homes on reservations that wouldn't be settled by the white man in exchange for promises of the Native Americans to start assimilating farming methods, government, and rules applied by the European settlers. European settlers started moving on to the lands that were ceded by the Native Americans. Agents were assigned to the reservations by the government with the responsibility of dispersing payments of money and supplies. Unfortunately, this did not happen as specified by the treaties. Corruption, misappropriation of funds and supplies kept the Native Americans from getting much of what was promised. In 1861 and 1862, crops and gardens being started by the tribes were overrun with cutworms, grasshoppers, and other wildlife, forcing the tribes to be even more dependent on promised supplies that were not coming. Fur traders that were offering supplies to the tribes were doing so on credit. When payments did not arrive for the tribes, traders and agents using the help from the military made sure credit payments were made prior to the Native Americans receiving any funds. This often left the tribes with little or no money or supplies. And I think this part kind of sums it up well. In January of 1862, President Lincoln sent an envoy to Minnesota to investigate complaints made by the Native Americans as well as other officials about the corruption and mismanagement by the agents and fur traders. This envoy found that the promises made by the treaties were being mismanaged. He went on to say in his letters back to Lincoln that there were grave issues in the way the Native Americans were being treated and that it needed to be addressed immediately. In 1862, however, the U.S. was also in the middle of the Civil War. In fact, at the time of the start of the 1862 Dakota War, Union troops were preparing for the Second Battle of Bull Run. Lincoln's response back to the envoy was delayed. I'm sure much of his time was being devoted to the Civil War, and unfortunately, what was going on in Minnesota kind of took a back seat. Native Americans were becoming increasingly desperate as they were already starving, and they faced an oncoming winter that would bring lots of sickness and death. For them, this was becoming a problem they could no longer live with. For the settlers, initially, they themselves were largely innocent. They came based on government promises of land and a better life. There were many accounts in the documentation that I read that these settlers and Native Americans often got along, trading and treating each other with some respect. It is my opinion after doing the research that the war started due to the actions of a few officials that left Native Americans desperate, starving, and with little recourse. During and after the war, emotions and actions became much more divided between settlers and Native Americans, with government actions being taken that could almost be considered genocide. Well, for the next part of this story, I thought it might be best to bring us out to a location here. I'm at the old Ness Church here south of Litchfield, Minnesota. And brought you here for a couple reasons. Number one, it gives me a nice quiet spot. Hopefully the wind isn't too much, but it gives me a nice quiet spot that I can set up and record a little video without being interrupted and looking like a geek out here on the highway. But it also plays a pretty significant role in this story here towards the end that we'll get into in a little bit. On August 12th of 1862, a larger group of Native Americans had traveled north into Meeker County and McLeod County area to hunt. This area of the state was kind of along the southern edge of what became known as the Big Woods in Minnesota. Documentation of the event shows that this hunting party had no intent on killing settlers or anything like that. They were just going up to hunt and in one case to take care of some business concerning a wagon that was left with Captain George Whitcomb. One of the natives had either borrowed a wagon or loaned a wagon. The documentation wasn't real clear on that, but they were going to go up and take care of that business as well. A half dozen or so of these hunters were from the Wahpeton band that were staying in the area of Rice Creek, where it flows into the Minnesota River. So down along the Minnesota River, if you've explored that area, County 17 out of Redwood County takes you down to the old gold mine bridge. The bridge is still there. It's closed. You can't get across. But there is a minimum maintenance road that takes you back to the west of Gold Mine Bridge. And if you travel that road, it takes you back to what I call Zimmerly Park. There's a monument there for a young person who had passed away. But that minimum maintenance road crosses Rice Creek. So the Wahpeton band was staying in that area. On the morning of August 17th, 4 of the men from the Rice Creek area were passing along the Henderson-Pembina Road in the central part of Acton Township in Meeker County. Their names in English were Brownwing, Breaks Up and Scatters, Ghost That Kills, and Crawls Against. They came across some eggs in a nest along a fence line. An argument between the 4 happened when one of them took the eggs. The argument was based around stealing eggs and being very hungry and not wanting to cause issues with the white men who may own the eggs. It ended up turning into a discussion about being a coward and afraid of the white men and daring each other about who was maybe brave enough to kill a white man. A little bit later, the 4 ended up passing the house of Robinson Jones. Robinson had a cabin, and I believe it was also a small store. He was also the postmaster of that area. They stopped and visited with him. He then escorted them to the Baker house. The account of the event, at least initially, was friendly, with the Native Americans and the white settlers shooting at a target and then discussing a gun trade. The Native Americans had reloaded, and it sounded like in the documentation that the white settlers, after the target practice, had not. Suddenly, the Native Americans turned their guns on the settlers and ended up shooting and killing Howard Baker, Ann Baker, Robinson Jones, Varanus Webster, who just happened to be in the area. He was a new settler to the area. And then a little bit later, as they passed back by Robinson Jones' cabin, they killed Clara Wilson, who I believe was an adopted daughter to Robinson Jones. After the shooting, they fled the area on horseback and rode back to the Rice Creek area. So that's about 45, 50 miles to the south. From a book called The History of Redwood County. It describes the four reaching the village about twilight, jumping off exhausted horses yelling, "Get your guns, there is war with the whites and we have started it." Several chiefs ended up going to the home of Little Crow, where there was discussion as to what to do about the event. They discussed turning in the four, and also the fear of terrible vengeance that would occur because of the killings. A war council was held, and they ended up declaring war against the settlers. And again, a lot of that was based on their fear of the vengeance, the fact they were already starving, everything that had taken place, and they felt they had no other recourse. And this brings us to why this place here at Nest Church is somewhat significant. Because of the August heat, the bodies were quickly buried in a mass grave at the site of the old Nest Church, where we're at right now, about 3 miles from the site of the killing. The historic Nest Church stands today, is well maintained. It can be visited. The monument marks the grave for the 5 settlers on the north side of this church. Well, it's time to take you to the third and final spot that we're going to visit here in Meeker County. And in order to do so, we've got to skip ahead in history about a year from where we last met at Nest Church. The major conflicts of the Dakota War ended in about 6 weeks, with the last battle being the Battle of Wood Lake. Trials of around 400 Dakota people have taken place, with the largest mass execution in U.S. history occurred on December 26, 1862 in Mankato, with the hanging of 38 men. Many of the Sioux have been driven from Minnesota into the Dakotas and Nebraska with forced marches, needless to say, with much suffering and death along the way. Chief Little Crow has been around the Dakotas and southern Canada, meeting with others looking for support for his people or for the continued war effort, but with little or no success. In the early summer of 1863, Chief Little Crow had returned to Minnesota to gather horses and supplies. He was with his teenage son. On July 3rd, 1863, they were north of Hutchinson, Minnesota, within Meeker County, just north of the McLeod County line, picking wild raspberries, when they were spotted by Nathan Lamson and his son Chauncey. The Lamsons who were hunting fired upon them simply because they were Dakota. A brief exchange of gunfire occurred. Nathan Lamson first wounded Little Crow in the hip, and Little Crow returned fire, wounding Nathan in the shoulder. Chauncey Lamson then fired the fatal shot that struck Little Crow in the chest. Little Crow died shortly after, telling his son to flee back to the family at Devil's Lake. This is where I'm going to kind of end the story, and I really encourage you to look at some of the things that occurred with Little Crow, his body, and the fact that some of his body parts weren't returned to the family until 1971. Needless to say, it's a story in itself. But I think this is a good spot to end our video, and I hope you found it interesting and enjoyed the travels with us around Meeker County.